G'day there, you're watching the Aussie BIM Guru. Today I've got a presentation that's a little bit overdue. It's a fairly important one for Revit users. Today I'm going to teach you all about how to master keynoting in Revit. So I'm revisiting a pretty essential topic. I've done a video on Revit shared parameters before, and I'm going to follow a very similar video structure because I feel like this one worked really well and was a very popular video, and it helped a lot of people, especially BIM managers and model managers. So I hope that you find this useful as well. And in future, I'll also be doing one on assembly coding, which is a fairly similar topic. Anyway, Keynotes. So this is a guide for Revit users by a Revit user. So what I'm telling you here, I put in practice. So what are we going to cover? Well, we're going to begin by looking at the types of Keynotes available in Revit and how you can use them as well. I'm going to show you how you can manage it and set up a Keynote file, and then also how you can manage Keynote legends after this. And then I'll finish up just by talking about a couple of limitations that you need to be aware of if you're going to use keynoting. So there's a few types of keynotes that you can place in a model under the Annotate tab. These are element, material, and user keynotes, and they all behave in slightly different ways. Whilst they all call on a keynote file in the same manner, the way that they source that keynote is different. So you need to choose very carefully what type of keynote you're going to use, because you can't change the type of keynote you've used once you've placed that tag. Now it's important to understand that that tag is one family, but it can represent three different types of keynotes of that tag. So it's not a type of the family, it's actually an inbuilt way that the keynote placement works. So in this case, you can see I've tagged an element keynote here, and notice that this row is grayed out. So I can't change this into, say, a material tag after. I would need to go and place an entirely new tag. So you do need to be consistent in the way that you tag. As well as this, change values of keynotes very carefully as well. Notice that the key value of this tag is exposed. I can change it. But what's going to happen when I change this, because it's an element keynote, it's going to push that data back into the elements keynote field. So don't look at them like a piece of text like you might in, say, an AutoCAD program. Look at them more like something that's actually connected to the data live in most cases. Now there's three types of keynotes, like I said. The first one is an element keynote. So most loadable and system families in Revit will have a built-in keynote value. Note that this is a type parameter and it can't be changed to an instance parameter. So we've already seen one limitation of keynotes in the way that they're set up. So this is an element keynote. You can see here, for example, on the right with this roof type, I've associated the keynote RMC, or roof metal cladding. And in this case, this belongs to every placed instance of that type of the roof. Material keynotes are a little bit different. So unlike elements, these are associated with materials under their identity tab. In this case, you can see that I have a wall cladding keynote associated to a cladding material. Noting as well that the way that we tag with material keynotes is different as well, which I'll show you quite soon. In this case, the material keynote will pull the value out of the first thing that it sits on top of in the view. So they're mostly suitable in floor plans or elevations, where you might be, say, drawing out a floor finish or a wall finish, and you know that nothing's going to be in the way of that tag. As well as this, we have user keynotes. These are quite unique in that you still host them to an element when you place them, but once placed, it will prompt you to nominate a keynote instead. Noting in this case, this isn't drawing any data out of the host element. It's actually going to just be manually associated to a keynote. So in this case, it's more suited only really to cases where you're trying to keynote something that you can't keynote the way that you want to, or you don't want to push that data back into the element. A great example for this would be a typical note. A lot of the time people have a group of keynotes in their keynote file dedicated towards typical construction or detailing notes. And the great thing about a keynote is it locks down what that value says, and you can still associate it to any element you want it to. But in most cases, I try not to use them. So let's just briefly explore each of these three keynote types. So I'm going to be using my basic sample project that you can find on my bimguru.com.au website for free with a promo code. In this case, I've actually got a keynote file already connected to the file. So let's just go check out a sheet with some keynotes on it. I'll just go to a floor plan, and I'm just going to activate my floor plan view. Let's find something with an element keynote. So here is an element keynote tag. So when I go to place a keynote tag under Annotate, Keynote, I can pick one of those three options. So I'll pick an element keynote. Notice I've got a leader activated. I can also disable that. And you can see now that I can tag this up-down light with a keynote, and the element keynote in this case is UDL for up-down light. That's because I've associated that value at this level. I can also tag my floor as FCP because I've added a element keynote. Now this isn't really a very ideal way to tag a floor, because if the extent of this floor changes, the keynote's going to try and stay centered or placed in the same positioning method to how it was placed before. So maybe in this case we want to use a material keynote instead. So I'll go keynote, material keynote, and I can see in this case it's not quite drawing out the right value. Now sometimes it might not find the right value at first. In this case you can see it's calling out a paint value. If I just nudge this back and forth, it seems to fix it up. This is often a trick you might need to use with certain material keynotes and views. For some reason they don't always seem to derive the right value straight away. A little bit frustrating, but you can see now that I'm drawing out FCP. Now in this case it's not actually coming from the floor's properties. So if I just isolate this floor, even though it has the keynote of FCP, let's say I just add a subcode to it, notice that this code doesn't update. That's because it's actually coming from the material in the floor itself. So the topmost layer is a carpet material. Inside that carpet material is this code. If I update this one, it will actually update this value. So it's really important to understand where keynote values are stored and housed, and how you can manipulate them. So material keynotes are quite unique in that you can manage the same code across multiple elements and you're not relying on the elements keynote. But you do have to be careful how you manage them, because they can get a little bit confusing if you don't know whether a keynote in your company standard should be in an element or its material. As well as this, like I said, we have user keynotes. So I'll just add a leader in this case. Let's say I don't have a door keynote associated with this element, but I want to tag it as a door. So I could use a user keynote, or I could add an element keynote. Let's say I'm in a rush and I just want to put a user keynote on this door. As soon as I finish, I'm prompted to give this thing a keynote, and in this case it's sourcing my keynote file. I can see, oh, I have door.sgl, door single. There we go. And now I have a user keynote associated with this element. Now, why this is bad is if this element actually already has a keynote, or it gains one in future, we can see in this case it's actually a double door. Notice this keynote has no relationship to the data of that element. So in this case, this becomes a little bit like dumb text. The only thing that's special about it is that it's hosted to the element. So if the element moves around, the user keynote will move with it. So you do have to be very careful when you use these. And like I said, you can't go and change this into an element keynote once you've nominated it. So just be mindful that they are very restrictive in how they should be used, mainly just for things like general notes that you wouldn't associate with an elements keynote. So that's pretty much a little crash course in keynotes. We're just going to jump forward. So how do you use a keynote? Like, what's the purpose of a keynote? This is probably the most important thing for you to decide, or your company to decide, before you commit to the system. To be honest, a keynote is really just a code with an associated description. That's all it is. From there, it can ultimately be whatever you want it to be, whatever you need it to be, as long as it suits those criteria and it suits the use of using things like keynote legends, for example, because they're unique to a keynote. So some common uses for keynotes, they really do fall under three possible use cases. The first one is an element code. For example, if you have a schedule of finishes, that finish code could be the keynote. This is probably a good use because you can obviously do material finishes and use material keynotes. No other system can really do this in Revit. You can also use them for specification reference codes, for example the NatSpec system in Australia, and also classification systems such as Uniclass 2015. I'm going to talk a little bit later about why you probably wouldn't want to use keynotes for those two situations. But in my opinion, element codes is the intended and best use for keynotes. So for example, a code for a chair would be perfect for a keynote. You could obviously use a shared parameter as well, but you'd have to use something like a multi-category tag, and to get this value into a keynote legend wouldn't be possible. So this is my coding convention I use for keynotes, and just generally coding overall. It's come from about 10 years of experience and observing how architecture firms have tried and often failed to capture a universal coding system that suits their needs. In this case, it's firstly made up of a letter on the front, which represents the master set of codes that the code belongs to. For example, F dot would be furniture, J dot joinery, internal, external finishes, services, and structure. It tries to keep it very flexible and expandable. The next three characters typically describe the object. So what is the object? From here, we've already established whether it's a piece of furniture or whether it's external or internal to the building. So we're able to use the same codes if we need to cross master category. But in this case, for example, chair might be CHA, TAB might be table. The intent here is it's something that's human readable, ideally. So if it's going to be paint, don't make it XXX. Make it something that looks like paint, if possible. And the final part is two numbers, which describe the variation on the code. Now, it doesn't have to be two numbers. It could be a number and a letter. I just try to be consistent. And you have pretty much 99 codes available for each primary object of that master class. So it's a fairly big system that typically won't run out of codes ideally. And from here, you can do things like make a chair type 1 for meeting chairs, chair type 2 for waiting chairs, etc. You can expand that catalog to suit. But ideally, my system is mainly intended to be machine readable. So whilst humans can read the code in the middle and understand what type of object they're looking at on a drawing, or cross-reference it in a Keynote legend, I'm using delimiters. So in this case, I have a dot, I have a dash, and I have strings of fixed width. Now, the strings of fixed width aren't that critical. It's more the positioning of the delimiters and how that breaks up the data. Because what this allows me to do is filter my codes very easily in either Revit or something like Dynamo, or filter the data in Excel. So I can do things like, does the Keynote begin with F? That'll let me just isolate all my furniture codes. Or maybe, does it end with a particular variation of a type of object? I want to find all chair and table type 1s. I can do ends with O1. Or maybe I just want to find all my chair codes. I can say, does it contain CHA dash? Or even, does it begin with F.CHA? Because I know they should all be furniture. So it gives me a lot of flexibility in a data-rich environment, which I find a lot of companies don't manage to establish. Here's an example of just me using some keynotes in an elevation. I've highlighted the material keynotes in yellow. So in this case, you can see they're typically sitting upon the surface of something. You can see on the balustrades, I've used a leader, but whilst the material keynote isn't sitting on top of the balustrade, the leader is, which is where the material keynote sources its value from. You can see I've just highlighted some elements in blue where I'm using element keynotes. In this case, I usually use element keynotes for things like fixtures, and I use a different type of keynote tag, which doesn't have that diamond end. You can see the same sort of setup here, where in a kitchen, I've actually highlighted one of those yellow by accident. Ignore the cupboard over the fridge, that should be blue. But you can see when I've had those wall tiles, I've used a material keynote. But for all the other elements, I've used a fixture keynote. In this case, some of my families, I actually hide the representation of the object in elevation so I can show 2D lines. So in this case, a material keynote would have no 3D surface to pull a value from. So I do need to use fixture keynotes in this case. Now you can use this as a specification reference. For example, the NatSpec system breaks down a specification into sub-numerical systems. And whilst this does lend itself well to a keynoting structure, it's really not that suitable for what keynotes can be used for, in my opinion. So why not use specification references? Well, first of all, standards change. Ultimately, a keynote to me is a handle of data. It's something that you want to consistently rely on knowing what it should be. And from there, you can link up all sorts of other data to that handle if you need to. So if your chairs are always under a specification system, if you have the code CHA and that object, you can easily match that up to a specification section. You could also just store your specification code as a shared parameter as well. As well as this, I find specification systems change from project or also by client. So if you need to change all the data in Keynotes very quickly, this can be quite difficult. Unless you have a really good process of matching up all your specification systems and using something like Dynamo or an add-in to change all that data, it can be very difficult. So I find a shared parameter is more suitable. In this case as well, people writing specifications in a company typically aren't BIM authors. So if they need to make a change to something on a drawing, they usually have to go and bother someone because the specification sections have updated. And I find too, people are really bad at staying consistent to the way a specification should be structured based on a predefined system. So whilst we do have the NatSpec system, I know that most companies will go and muck around with some of the numbers to make the specification read better. So obviously it doesn't really establish a good system in terms of maintaining consistency across a company. As well as this, you're not really going to utilize tags or Keynote legends, which are two of the best things about Keynotes. In this case, you'd probably never tag the specification reference for an element on a drawing, and as a result, you wouldn't see it in a Keynote legend. So it's a bit of a wasted opportunity if you use this. Alternatively, keynoting structure sort of lends itself to assembly coding or classification coding. For example, a uniclass or an omni-format system. There's a few reasons why I wouldn't use this in the same case as well. First of all, I find assembly code files are much more suitable. They're a much more tree-based hierarchy system in how they're structured. As a result, they lend themselves much better to classification codes instead. There's also a lot of companies out there producing free assembly code files, such as Digital Gorilla. So in this case, you could use their file, and it's not a Keynote file. Again, the classification system will change from project to project. Sometimes you might use Uniclass 15, sometimes you might use OmniClass or OmniFormat. So I find that it's risky to put this so deeply embedded into your objects. Again, you're probably not going to be tagging them or utilizing the Keynote legends, so it's a bit of a wasted opportunity. So I usually encourage people to stray away from these. And very commonly in Australia, people want to use the NatSpec system in keynoting, and I always recommend against it. I say make your own coding convention, and then you can use data matching programs in order to connect those codes. So Keynote files. This is where the Keynote is ultimately sourcing its description from. So it goes and finds the Keynote code, and then it matches up its description to suit. It also lets us delimit the number of codes possible in a model. So if someone uses a code that doesn't appear in the Keynote legend, it won't return a description, and as a result, you'll know that it's not actually something that's valid in the context of your keynotes. So essentially, Keynote files are tab delimited files. That means all the data is separated by tabs, and that's how everything is structured. So in this case, we have the Keynote first, then a tab, then the description of that Keynote as it lines up to that code. From there, you can optionally associate that Keynote to a group or a subgroup. Whatever you put here, it's going to go back and search for the group with that particular reference. Now in this case, you can see this general group. Now what that general group actually is the Keynote general with no group. So that's a master group. So in this case, you're actually referencing back to the Keynote value of that group, not its description. So I'll show you how to subgroup Keynote files shortly as well, and you'll get a better understanding of how Keynote files are structured. So you can actually make a Keynote file in Excel, because Excel can output tab delimited structures. So essentially you would lay it out a little bit like this. I'm going to go and just build a fresh Keynote file just to show you how you could set one up. So I'm just going to start an entirely new project, just from no template. And I'm just going to build a Keynote file in Excel. And we're just going to build a few subgroups and a few codes. So the first thing you'll want to do is declare your master group. So in this case, I'm just going to declare a few groups. I usually like to either put my groups at the very beginning or put the groups first, then the subgroups, then the codes, and keep going in that order. Let's just make a few groups. Let's just say furniture, finishes, and notes. Now we're going to declare a couple of keynotes. So let's just say f.cha.01 is chair meeting. Make this a bit wider. And chair meeting could belong to furniture, or maybe we can make a subgroup. In this case, I'll just make it the master group first of furniture. Let's just make another code, and we'll just make a table. We'll just make two codes for now. For finishes, let's in this case make one finish, i.pnt01, and I'll just call this internal paint under finishes. I'll copy this, and I'll call this e.pnt01. So I've got an external and an internal paint finish. Finally, let's make some general notes. So usually for notes, I like to give them just a keynoting order. So I'll just call this note 1, and I'll say, refer structural engineers drawings. And I'll put this under notes, and I'll just copy this, and I'll make another note, and I'll just say refer mechanical engineers drawings. Okay, so at this point we have a basic Keynote file. Everything's going to be grouped in major groups. So I'm just going to save this file to desktop, the best place to put your files. Not really. I'm just going to get this a tab delimited file, so a txt file. And I'm just going to call this testing keynotes. And in this case, I'm going to go back into Revit, and on the annotate tab, I'm going to go Keynote, keynoting settings. I'm going to browse to my Keynote file I've just made, and I'm just going to open it. Now in this case, it can't open it, so I must have made a mistake in the structuring of the data. I'm just going to check. I think I know what's went wrong. So in this case, these have tabs on them. So I think they're not meant to have tabs. I think that's probably the problem that I've run into. And I'll probably also have to close the Excel source as well. Okay, I've still made a mistake. So I know usually you have to be careful with the way these files are structured. I might just compare it to a valid Keynote file and just identify the delimiting difference in how these work. Interesting. In this case, I might just really dumb it down just back to one Keynote and just find that difference. Unsuccessful, still not working. Unsuccessful. Maybe it's just because I have the file open, possibly. No, still not working. There we go, it worked. So it seems like there's some sort of tedium between the creation process and whether you have a file open. That's a little bit annoying, but yeah, I guess there's a little bit of tedium involved in how a Keynote file is configured. But once you have that file, it's up to you whether you want to work in this format. In my case, I think I'll take out these apostrophes. So you may need to do a little bit of data cleaning when you're finished, just to make sure these are clean. But I can now see I have a chair keynote associated to a furniture group. I'll just reintroduce another group, and I might just work in the txt file this time. So I'll just say finishes, and I'll just go add a code. So I go i.pnt01. I'll keep that tab there, and I'll just call this paint finish. And I'll put this under the finishes group. If I reload, there we go. Now you can see I have two groups. Let's just go and add that external paint finish back again. So yeah, it looks like Excel, there's a few processes you might want to be careful of in this case. Now let's say I want to break my finishes into internal and external. So what I have to do now is create a group called internal. Now I remember if I use internal, that means that code is no longer available. So what I might do instead is call this e.finishes. This belongs to finishes, so I can just call this external finishes, belongs to finishes. And I'll also make a subgroup called i.finishes. Now at this point, if I reload, what I'll have is I'll have the groups and the codes parallel. So I need to subgroup my codes from here. So I'm going to go back to my file, and to the I code, I'm going to go i.finishes and e.finishes. And now if I reload, if I go into finishes, you can see now these codes are sub-associated. So you can keep pushing things down in the tree by reassociating them back to the next level up by Keynote. But you can see at the top, you do have that master level where it doesn't belong to anything. That is just the top of your file. So it's a really handy file structure to learn about, but essentially once you understand the reassociation of objects back up an extra level, it sort of comes together. But it's important to note too, you do have to be careful that you don't make any errors in a Keynote file. One common error is to miss out a group, and in this case, there's going to be no parent Keynote for some codes. For example, the chair has nowhere to put itself, so it just gets automatically sorted to the very top of the Keynote file. So you will need to fix that. Likewise, Keynotes have to be unique. So let's say I accidentally made these i.pnt twice. If I reload, there's a duplicate code. So in this case, if I go to view my finishes, it rejects one of them. So in this case, it doesn't actually accept the second one that it comes across. So you do need to make sure that all your keynotes are unique, which is probably quite good because you usually really don't want a code to represent more than two things in an architectural system. So pretty much from there, we have a successful keynoting system. And from there, I do have the option, if I have a wall, and let's say I want to do an element keynote on that. In this case, I don't have a keynote tag, so I'm going to have to go find one. I believe that in Revit 2020, the keynoting tag is gone. So if you do want to make a keynote tag, you might need to change the type of tag when you make a new tag family. I believe if you go to generic tag, and then up to the family properties, you can make it a keynote tag. But there's no keynote tag template as far as I can see. So if I make a label, notice I can only add keynote value and keynote text, so I'll talk about this right at the end. For now, I'm just going to add the keynote value. Now I can tag this with an element keynote. Now at the moment it has no keynote, so it's prompting me to give it a keynote. So I can say, okay, maybe this is a external paint finish. And what that's done is that's went into the family and given it this keynote because it didn't have one. But from that point onwards, if I ever change a keynote, it's going to go and update this. And this keynote will always understand its keynote text as well, even though it doesn't necessarily have to show it to you. Also, if I go to change a keynote, I can click these three dots to access my keynote file, and from there I can go and find another keynote if I wish. Now, if I use a keynote that doesn't match anything, it still accepts it in the tag, but the tag has no keynote text. So in this case, you do have to be careful that you don't stray outside what's available to your keynote tag. Likewise, I can also use a user keynote to call this, say, a chair, even though the element keynote is saying it's not. Again, showing the risk of an element keynote because I'm essentially telling it something that it's not. But of course, I could actually add those notes back into my keynote file. I'll say notes, and I'll just say note 1. I'll just refer engineers' drawings and put it under notes. And I have to go back and update my keynote file. And now I can change this to that note. Now in this case, I'm showing the keynote value. So what I would actually need to do is make this the keynote's description. And then just reload my tag. And I might want to make this say left justified possibly. And now, obviously it's going to go and change the paint's description as well, but you can see now I have a way of setting typical notes using a Keynotes file. And this is usually the best way that I've seen to do this if you have typical notes used across your company. As well as this, I can go and do a material Keynote tag just by locking my view. And if I go to my wall, go to its structural layer by category, and I'll just change this to something, say I'll just make this default. I can go and associate a Keynote here as well. Maybe an internal paint finish. But this can be in conflict with the Elements keynote itself. So even though the Walls keynote is IPNTO2, the Finish keynote is different. So in this case, I can go and add a Material keynote, which will derive that paint. Obviously, it's doing the description right now, but you can see there the key value is IPNTO1. If I go and change that to something else, say IPNTO3, notice that it no longer finds a valid keynote description to call upon. Likewise, if I go back to the material, notice that it's changed that value at this level as well. So you just have to be careful about how you interact with keynote tags and keynotes as well. Once you understand the three types and what they're actually calling on, it pretty much comes together. So that's how you can build your very own keynote file. I find that's usually a difficult step for most people. So we showed how to connect the file and reload it. There are some apps out there that can help you manage and set up your keynotes as well. One example is Ideate Explorer, which will let you actually isolate keynote tags by value, which is very useful. So if you know that you've phased out a code in your company, but you're looking for anywhere that the wrong code is tagged, you can use Ideate Explorer to hunt down those elements. I find that's very useful. It also tells you whether they're element, material, or user keynotes, which is really great as well. Likewise, there's a app, I believe by Revolution Design. It's a paid app as well. These are both paid apps. There is a 30-day trial on it, and that lets you actually hunt down your elements by Keynote as well. Personally, I find Ideate Explorer much more easy to use, but the Revolution app is much more focused on just that particular task. One last thing I'll show you is keynoting legends. These are really important if you want to set up something that can tell you what the codes on your drawing actually mean on that same drawing, which is a common need, and keynotes are really the only thing that can capably do this. So if I go back to my actual project, you'll notice on this particular sheet, I have a legend, and this legend is fully responsive to things that I tag. For example, this FCPO1 has now appeared in my legend because I went and actually remember I tagged that floor. If I take out the tag, my Keynote legend updates, and you can see that the Keynote values that are tagged are drawing upon their value from the keynoting file. So it's a really powerful system if you have your Keynote file well set up. You can essentially just keep tagging, and as you tag, the legend will automatically grow. And I can see here, for example, if I just go and add a few more tags, say an element Keynote tag, and I'll use my fixture Keynote type, and I just add a tag here. These aren't actually meant to be tagged, but if I tag my toilet, maybe this drain, I can see that I have obviously got my no scheduling Keynote, but as well as this, I also have a few other things that have joined the party. I can see I now have a toilet Keynote, and I have a drain keynote. Now if I go into this legend, and you can make them just under view legends, keynote legend. If I go into it, at the moment I'm seeing all the keynotes in my project essentially that have been tagged. But I can filter this by sheet just by ticking on this box under the filtering tab, which is how it's only showing me the values on the sheets. You'd nearly always want to do this unless you're making a typical codes legend on, say, a cover page. As well as this, you can sort and also filter by value. Let's say I don't want to see those no schedule codes. I can say that key value does not equal no shed. Now, because I have a robust system, I could go even deeper than that if I wanted to. Let's say every keynote has at least a dot in it. I could say that key value contains dot. But at the moment, I do have some codes that don't contain a dot. So now I'm just going to say it does not equal no shed. I'm back on my sheet. I can see I've filtered out that keynote value. So as long as you structure your keynotes well, you can pretty much do this. Say you're putting typical notes on the same drawing as well. You're not going to want those notes to show up every time you tag them. They're just there for the sake of convenience. So you could filter keynotes by does not contain note, for example. You just need a system to follow, essentially. So keynote legends are very important as well. But we've pretty much covered everything, I guess. That's really all that I think people typically need to know about using keynotes. I showed you some limitations. For example, the keynote tag can only support key value and key description. You'll also find that other types of tags, such as multi-category tags, don't work the same way that keynote tags do. So you do sort of want to reserve keynotes for a very particular use case when you really can benefit from that keynote legend the most. And as well as that, you just really need to be aware of how element, user, and material keynotes behave, and make sure that users know which type to use at which time. Just a few high-level recommendations to the BIM managers or the super users out there. Definitely design an expandable system. You're welcome to use my system, but make sure that it works for your needs, and if a new code is required, there's room for it in the system. You're not going to want to run out of room. That's really something you can't afford to happen, especially when you're managing a coding system at a company level. Also, try to manage one file if possible. Try not to have one Keynote file per project. Instead, try to keep your codes generic and applicable cross-project if possible. Of course, people can add more keynotes to them, but if you're developing a master company library, it's better to make this reference back to the master keynote file. That way projects can always be up to date, technically. As well as this, make sure that you get buy-in from executive level of your company. You don't want to go and roll out a standard across the company at the keynote level and then find out that the managing director doesn't agree with it. Obviously, that's going to take a long time to wind back on projects, templates, libraries, so make sure that they agree with whatever you do. That way you don't have to double back later. As well as this, make sure keynotes exist in your content at the library or the template level. That way users can just tag with confidence from the beginning. And that's really, I guess, the way it's intended to be used, I think. And of course, to all the BIM managers out there, keep a couple of backups of your keynote file, just in case someone goes and mucks around with it, because they're pretty sensitive files to change, as you've seen. So hopefully that helps you better understand keynoting and apply it in context of your work and learning. If you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so. And I look forward to sharing other similar high-level master tutorials like this one in future. See you in the next video. Thanks. Take care. Bye.